All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive on something I think a lot of people are curious about. But it can be kind of overwhelming to even know where to begin. We're talking hair restoration, specifically those big single-section hair transplants you hear about, where they're moving thousands of grafts at once. The source material we've got for this deep dive is a podcast episode from PROFUE Talks, and these folks really get down into the weeds. They're all about the FUE technique, which stands for follicular unit extraction. And in this episode, they were talking about how it's actually possible to restore a significant amount of hair loss in just one session. We're talking up to 12,000 hairs transplanted. So
Yeah.
I know that can sound kind of intimidating. So we're here to break it down and help you understand what's really involved.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing that they can do so much in a single session. Like when they talk about 4,000 grafts, that's a huge number. But it's important to clarify that a graft isn't just one hair. Each graft can contain multiple hair follicles, sometimes up to 4. So 4,000 grafts could actually mean something like 12,000 hairs being transplanted.
Wow, that's a lot of hair.
Yeah.
And when you think about all those individual grafts being moved, it really makes you appreciate the precision involved in the FUE technique.
Right, and that's one of the big advantages of FUE. It's incredibly meticulous, so each graft is extracted individually from the donor area, which is typically the back of the scalp, and then they meticulously transplant it to the recipient area. And because they're not removing a whole strip of scalp like they do in the older FUT method,
Yeah.
follicular unit transplantation, the scarring is significantly reduced.
But FUE is all about minimizing the trauma to the scalp, which makes a lot of sense, especially when we're talking about these large-scale procedures. And in the podcast, they mentioned that these types of transplants are generally best suited for people with advanced hair loss who are looking for a comprehensive solution in a single session.
Yeah, and I think it's important to acknowledge the emotional impact of hair loss too. It can really affect a person's self-esteem and their confidence. It's not just about aesthetics, it's about restoring a sense of normalcy and well-being. And the podcast host really emphasized that point.
Mhm. And they were talking about how a lot of people are choosing to have these procedures done because they want to avoid having multiple sessions spread out over months or even years, which is understandable. But I'm curious, why is FUE considered the go-to method for these larger procedures? We've heard about other techniques as well, so what makes this one stand out?
Well, I think it really comes down to minimizing trauma and maximizing graft survival. When you're transplanting thousands of grafts, you need to be as minimally invasive as possible, both to the donor area and the recipient area. And FUE really allows for that precision, which in turn promotes better healing and ultimately better results.
Like microsurgery for your scalp. And speaking of precision, they mentioned in the podcast that this particular clinic uses some advanced tools like sapphire blades. What's the advantage of those?
Well, sapphire blades are incredibly sharp and precise, and that allows for much cleaner incisions and less tissue damage during both the extraction and the implantation process. And this can lead to faster healing and potentially even better graft survival rates.
So it seems like technology is really playing a significant role in advancing the field of hair restoration.
Absolutely. And it's not just the tools either. There have also been huge advancements in storage solutions for the extracted grafts to ensure their viability until they're implanted.
So speaking of location, one thing that stood out in the podcast was the focus on Antalya, Turkey, as a prime destination for these procedures. Why do you think that is?
Well, it seems like Antalya is really striking a balance between providing high-quality medical care and offering a desirable setting for recovery. In fact, the podcast host even used the word art to describe hair transplantation, emphasizing the skill and aesthetics involved. And it seems like Antalya is really cultivating that reputation.
And they also touched on the cost factor, noting that these procedures tend to be significantly more affordable in Antalya compared to places like the UK or the US.
Yeah, and that affordability is a big draw for a lot of people. It makes these procedures accessible to a much wider audience. But it's really important to do your research and choose a reputable clinic with experienced surgeons, regardless of the location.
That's a great point. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, graft survival. So with thousands of grafts being transplanted, is there a risk of lower survival rates compared to smaller procedures?
That's a really good question, and it's something that the podcast addressed directly. They emphasize that graft survival is absolutely paramount, especially in these large-scale transplants, and they highlighted the fact that they use specialized storage solutions to keep the grafts healthy and very precise implantation techniques to minimize what's known as shock loss, which is basically the shedding of transplanted hairs due to trauma.
So shock loss is normal.
To a certain extent, yes, but by minimizing the trauma. and ensuring optimal graft handling. They're aiming to maximize the number of grafts that successfully take root and grow.
So even though it's a much larger procedure, the quality and the outcome shouldn't be compromised if you have the right expertise.
That seems to be the message they're conveying. Of course, every individual is different, and there are always factors that can influence the final results. But with experienced surgeons and advanced techniques and proper post-operative care, these large-scale transplants can be incredibly successful.
That's reassuring to hear. So let's say someone decides to go ahead with one of these 4,000 graft transplants in Antalya. What can they expect in terms of the recovery process?
Well, it's important to have realistic expectations. It's not an overnight transformation. There will be some redness and swelling immediately after the procedure, which is completely normal. And then there's the shedding phase, where the transplanted hairs actually fall out, which can be a little bit unnerving for some people, but it's a natural part of the process. It's basically the grafts entering a resting phase before new growth begins.
So you don't just walk out of there with a full head of hair.
Not quite. It takes time for the new hair to grow in and thicken up. They mentioned that the full results usually take about 6 to 12 months to really become apparent.
That's a pretty significant waiting period.
It is, and during that time, it's really crucial to follow the postoperative care instructions carefully. This particular clinic really emphasizes patient education, and they provide detailed guidance throughout the entire process, which can make a big difference in the final outcome.
So it sounds like they really prioritize patient care and support.
They do, and I think that's really essential, especially when dealing with a procedure as significant as this.
Yeah, it's not just a physical transformation, it's an emotional journey as well.
Exactly. And the podcast host was very clear about that, describing it as a life-changing experience for a lot of their patients. They talked about how restoring someone's hair can restore their confidence and their self-esteem and just a sense of wholeness.
That's really powerful. It makes you realize that hair is so much more than just strands on our head. It's tied to our identity, in our sense of self, and our well-being.
Absolutely. And that's why choosing to undergo a hair transplant is a really deeply personal decision that should be carefully considered.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered a lot of ground, from the intricacies of the FUE technique to the transformative potential of hair restoration. But before we get too carried away, I think it's time to take a little pause and reflect on what we've learned so far. We'll be back soon to continue our deep dive into this fascinating world.
You know, it's interesting. They talk a lot about Antalya, but it's important to remember that there are great clinics and surgeons all over the world.
That's true. It's easy to get caught up in the hype of one particular location, but ultimately it's about finding the right fit for you, wherever that may be.
Exactly. And that means considering factors like the surgeon's experience, their approach to hair restoration, the clinic's reputation, and of course the cost. It's a big decision, so it's worth taking the time to really do your research.
Speaking of research, I'm curious about the long-term outlook for these large-scale transplants. We've talked about the immediate results and the recovery process, but what about 5, 10, even 20 years down the line? What can people realistically expect?
Well, that's where the artistry and the expertise of the surgeon really come into play. You know, they need to consider not just your current hair loss, but also how it might progress in the future. A skilled surgeon will take into account things like your age, your genetics, and your hair loss patterns to design a transplant that's going to look natural and be sustainable over time.
So it's not just about filling in the gaps you have now, it's about anticipating future hair loss and creating a plan that can adapt to those changes.
Exactly. And that involves understanding the nuances of using different graft sizes and densities. For example, smaller grafts might be used to create a natural hairline, while larger grafts can add density to areas with more significant thinning. It's all about creating a balanced and harmonious result.
It sounds like there's a lot of thought and planning that goes into these procedures.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so critical to choose a surgeon who really understands both the science and the art of hair transplantation, someone who can create a truly personalized plan that meets your individual needs and goals.
And speaking of goals, I think it's important to have realistic expectations. The PROFUE Talks host was very clear about that. They stress that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and that results can vary depending on a range of individual factors.
Right. Things like your age, your overall health, the quality of your donor hair, even your lifestyle, all of these things can play a role in how your transplant turns out.
So it's not a guarantee of a full, luscious head of hair for everyone.
Unfortunately not. It's really important to have an open and honest conversation with your surgeon about what's achievable and what's not. It's about setting realistic goals and managing expectations.
That makes sense. Now, we've talked a lot about the physical aspects of hair transplantation, but I think it's equally important to address the emotional side of things. Hair loss can be a very personal and often distressing experience, and the decision to undergo a transplant is not something to be taken lightly.
Absolutely. Hair loss can affect a person's self-esteem, their confidence, even their social interactions. And it's often compounded by societal pressures and expectations, particularly for men, who are often told that a full head of hair is synonymous with masculinity.
And we can't forget about women who experience hair loss. It can be just as devastating for them, leading to feelings of self-consciousness.
And a loss of femininity.
Exactly. Hair loss doesn't discriminate, and the emotional toll can be significant, regardless of gender. The PROFUE Talks host talked about how hair restoration can be a transformative experience, not just physically, but emotionally as well.
Yeah, it's about reclaiming a part of yourself that you may have felt like you'd lost, regaining that sense of confidence, and feeling comfortable in your own skin again. It can be incredibly empowering. And I think it's important to acknowledge that seeking help for hair loss, whether it's a transplant or a medication, or even just accepting your hair loss and finding ways to embrace your unique beauty, it's a sign of strength, not weakness.
I love that. It's about taking control of your hair journey and making choices that align with your values and priorities.
Exactly. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs. But with the right support and information, you can navigate it with confidence.
We've talked about the FUE technique, the potential for large-scale restoration, the importance of choosing the right clinic and surgeon, and the emotional aspects of hair loss. But there's one more crucial aspect of hair transplantation that we need to address, and that's the recovery process. So what can people expect after they've undergone a procedure like this?
Well, the immediate aftermath can be a little bit daunting. You know there's going to be some redness, swelling, possibly some discomfort. It's really important to follow your surgeon's post-operative care instructions very carefully to ensure proper healing and minimize the risk of any complications.
So I imagine there were some restrictions on activities
Yeah,
and certain products that you can use.
absolutely. Things like strenuous activities, swimming, exposure to direct sunlight, those are typically off limits for a certain period of time, and you'll need to use gentle shampoos and avoid any harsh styling products. The clinic will provide you with very detailed guidelines on what to do and what to avoid.
So it's a little bit of a lifestyle adjustment for a while.
It is, but it's important to remember that this is a temporary phase, and the long-term benefits are often well worth the short-term inconvenience.
What about the dreaded shock loss that we talked about earlier? When does that typically happen, and how long does it last?
Well, shock loss usually occurs a few weeks after the procedure, and it's a normal part of the process, as the transplanted hairs go through a shedding phase before the new growth begins, and it can be alarming to see those hairs falling out, but it's important to remember that it's only temporary.
How long does that shedding phase usually last?
It varies from person to person, but it usually lasts a couple of months.
Yeah.
And then you'll start to see new hair growth emerging from those transplanted follicles.
So there's a light at the end of the shedding tunnel.
Absolutely. And once that new growth starts coming in, it's incredibly rewarding to see the transformation taking place.
It must be quite a journey, both physically and emotionally.
It is. It's a journey that requires patience,
Yeah.
realistic expectations, and a good support system.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the technical aspects of FUE to the emotional and psychological considerations of hair transplantation. Before we wrap up our deep dive, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most.
You know what I find most fascinating is the level of personalization involved in modern hair restoration. It's not just about transplanting hair. It's about creating a natural, sustainable result that really complements the individual's facial features, their hair characteristics, and their personal style.
Like tailoring a suit, but for your scalp.
Exactly. And that requires a deep understanding of the science of hair growth, the artistry of hairline design, and the empathy to really connect with the patient's emotional needs.
And speaking of connecting with the patient, the emphasis on patient education and support throughout the entire process really stood out to me.
It's so crucial. You know, a hair transplant is a significant decision, both physically and emotionally. And patients really need to feel informed, empowered, and supported every step of the way.
I couldn't agree more. Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on. But before we say goodbye, let's take a moment to recap the key takeaways from our deep dive into the world of hair restoration. All right, so we're back, ready to wrap things up. You know, it's really interesting. thinking back on everything we've discussed, it's amazing how we've gone way beyond just the mechanics of transplanting hair.
Right. It really is a multifaceted topic. We've talked about the science, the artistry, the emotional aspects, even the global landscape of hair restoration. So much to consider.
For sure. If you had to pick just one, what would you say is the most significant takeaway for our listeners?
That's a tough one. But I think the biggest takeaway is that hair restoration, especially with a technique like FUE, can be incredibly transformative.
Yeah.
And it's not just about regaining your hair. It's about regaining your confidence and feeling like yourself again, like they said in that podcast, a life-changing experience.
Yeah, and they were really emphasizing how that transformation goes beyond just the physical changes.
Yeah.
Addressing the emotional impact of hair loss, which can be really significant for a lot of people.
Definitely.
So for anyone listening who might be struggling with hair loss, I think the key message here is that you're not alone. There are options available, and advancements are being made all the time.
Absolutely.
Whether it's FUE or another technique or even medication, there are ways to address hair loss and regain that sense of confidence.
And as we talked about, it's so important to choose a reputable clinic and a skilled surgeon, someone who really understands your individual needs and goals.
Couldn't agree more. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Do your research. Advocate for yourself.
That's such an important point.
Knowledge is power. The more you understand about the process, the risks, and the potential outcomes, the better equipped you'll be to make an informed decision. A decision that's right for you.
Well said. And remember, it's a journey. It takes time, patience, realistic expectations. But with the right support and guidance, it can be an incredibly rewarding experience.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
No.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive. We hope you found this exploration informative and thought-provoking. And if you are considering hair restoration, we encourage you to consult with a qualified professional to discuss your individual case and explore all the options available to you. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep exploring the fascinating world of knowledge.